Good evening. Sorry that nobody knows what's happening. But what I am going to do, or what I'm prepared to do, is a sermon that takes about the length of the class time, and unless there's any opposition to that, in which case I'll do it as a class. All right, go for it. That was by an unbiased spectator. Said go for it. So that's what I'll do. All right. So tonight we are talking about home maintenance, and again, this is the third lesson in a series that is all about the home that we've been doing this week, starting here on Monday, and we talked about God's design for the home and choosing Him as the architect. Then Mike last night at Berea followed up on that, and he was describing the actual blueprint of the home. And then tonight we're talking about home maintenance. So once you've chosen God as the architect, and once you have gotten a blueprint in place, after that, you have to make sure that the home is in fact maintained. So that is the intent of what we're doing tonight. And just to be very clear, everyone that is here is part of a family. And some of the families may look a little bit different than others, and I don't just mean by attractiveness, but some of the families are not the same. So you may be a parent, or you may be a child, or you may be both. You may be a sibling to someone, you may be the aunt or the uncle, you may be a guardian to someone, but everyone here is part of a family. And being part of a family, that means that this lesson is going to apply to you in a very personal way, or at least it should. So in maintaining the home that you already have chosen God as the architect for, hopefully, and the home that you know the blueprint for from God, then you have to make sure that it is maintained properly. So also as we start out, I'll remind you or inform you of a quote by our former president, Ronald Reagan, which is that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. Okay? The same thing applies to a godly home. A godly home is never more than one generation away from extinction. And it can work both ways. You can see homes that prior to this generation had no godly influence whatsoever. But a whole lot of the time you also see the opposite happen, where you had a godly home and then it just took one generation and it's gone. So we don't want that to be the case for us. So we need to prevent that from happening by making sure that we are maintaining. So the first thing I want to do is establish that a home is in fact worth maintaining. If you think of a physical home, if you think of whatever home you live in, there are reasons that it's worth maintaining or worth making repairs to, wherever the case may be. So in an actual home, it may be that the home itself is so well designed that you want to make sure that that design stays intact. So maybe the floor plan is very good, or maybe just the bones of the house are very good. And you might even do some remodeling to the home, but you maintain the home because there is inherent value in its design. And we talked about that on Monday night. Because on Monday night we said that there is all kinds of value in God's design of the home. So that's one reason you might maintain a home. The second reason that you might maintain a home is that it is better than the alternative. And a lot of people go back to older times and to older things and think of the better quality that is found in them. And that is true of homes, especially the architectural quality of homes has gone downhill significantly over the last century. So some people want to get back to older homes and maintain those because they have value based on the fact that they're better than what's available today. They're better than the alternative. Same thing is true of the godly home in both cases. So the godly home is better designed. That's why it's worth maintaining. And we talked quite a bit about that design. We talked quite a bit about the function of the home, but maybe a few things that we didn't touch on Monday would be that one of the functions of the home is mutual support. So the members of a home, however the members are arranged, should be mutually supportive of one another. And that applies in a lot of different senses, but let me give you a few. It certainly applies in a financial sense. So members of the home are supposed to take care of each other from a financial perspective. If you look in 1 Timothy chapter 5, and in verse 8, there's a verse there that's pretty familiar with a lot of us. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, it says, "If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." And if you put this verse in the context of 1 Timothy chapter 5, it becomes stronger in what it's saying. Because there, the instructions are being given on how to take care of widows. And the point is being made that you take care of your own. You take care of your own widows in your own house. And if you skip down to verse 16 in the same chapter, it says that if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them. And do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. So it's saying if a widow has a family to take care of them, they are the ones responsible for taking care of them, because family has a financial responsibility to mutually support one another. So there's a financial side to it. There's also a side in decision making and in wisdom. In Proverbs chapter 15, verse 22, it says that without counsel, plans go awry, but in the multitude of counselors, they are established. What better place to find a multitude of counselors that can help you make a decision about something in your life than people that already love you and already have your best interest in mind? So the home should be a place where decisions are made based on a group of counselors being the family there. And of course, there's the emotional and there's the spiritual support that has to be given within a home, and especially within a godly home. And that happens in a lot of different ways. But again, it should go all around the home. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 33, the very end of chapter 5, it says, "Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." So it's a two-way street there that's being identified. And the husband is supposed to love and supposed to support the wife. And in turn, the wife is supposed to respect and support the husband. The same thing applies to children and parents. If you skip down to Ephesians 6 and verse 4, it says in that text, "And you, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and the admonition of the Lord." And also in that same text, in verses 1, 2, and 3, it talks about the children being obedient to the parents. So again, there's a two-way street that happens there. But there should be mutual support on all sides within a family, because that's the design. And since it's so well designed by God, it's worth maintaining. But the other part of it is that the alternative is not as good. So that's one reason that you want to make sure you're maintaining if the alternative is not as good. And the alternative to God's plan for family, it's just not as good. Because the alternative is being alone. Well, according to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18, God said it was not good that man should be alone. That's not the desirable state for man to be in. And then also you see in 1 Kings, if you remember that story with Elijah, after Jezebel and Ahab have run him out of the city, he says that he alone is left and that they seek his life. Well, that's not a happy position to be in. So again, the alternative to the home is far worse than having the home. So you want to make sure that the home is maintained and that no one has to be alone. So a home needs maintaining. It's not just worth maintaining, but also needs to be maintained. In Matthew chapter 7, at the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, in verses 24 and following, there's a story that's familiar to you. It's a parable, and it's been turned into a lovely VBS song that will probably be sung next week. VBS next week here? Okay. Well, it'll probably be sung next week, and it has a lot to do with a wise man who built his house on what? On the rock. And a foolish man who built his house on what? Okay. So, according to the song and according to the verses, what happened when the rains came and the troubles of life came to the wise man's house? Stood firm. I don't see the hand motions happening. I'm disappointed. Okay. So what happened when the foolish man faced the same rains? Splat. Okay, much better, everybody. I like it. Here's the thing, though. As true as that is, if you don't build your house on the foundation of Jesus Christ, that it's going to collapse, that's not the only way that a house collapses. In fact, that might not be the most common way that a house collapses, even in real life. Sometimes houses do burn down. Sometimes there are natural disasters that destroy houses, but a whole lot of the time the process is much more sinister. It takes months, it takes years, it takes a long time of deterioration for a house to eventually fall down. And I'm going to suggest that's how it is with the home pretty often as well. I think there's a misconception about houses that are deteriorating. A lot of times people think that humans, are responsible for the destruction of homes. And they do a lot of damage to a home. But what happens when humans are not there and are not taking care of a home? The deterioration happens probably even more quickly than it would if someone were living there. So again, it's not necessarily that humans are doing that. It's also not just time itself that is destroying a home. Time does not make something decay. There are other forces that affect it, but it's what people do during that time, whether they maintain during that time. It's not the time itself that destroys. So what is the real enemy of the home? What's the real enemy of home maintenance? Number one is this. If you turn to Proverbs chapter 24, starting in verse 30. Proverbs chapter 24, starting in verse 30, there may not be any better text about the deterioration process of a home than this one. Proverbs chapter 24, starting in verse 30. It says, I went by the field of a lazy man, and by the vineyard of the man devoid of understanding. And there it was, all overgrown with thorns, its surface covered with nettles, its walls, or its stone wall was broken down. And when I saw it, I considered it well. I looked on it and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. And so shall your poverty come like a prowler, and your need like an armed man. What was the cause of this house being destroyed? It was laziness. It was just being lazy, just not doing what needed to get done. And that's what always happens when a house slowly crumbles over time. Somebody's being a little bit lazy. Somebody's not taking on the responsibility that they should. And it's not even that laziness itself is capable of destroying a house, but rather laziness causes neglect, which destroys a house. But the thing is, laziness is not the only way that neglect happens. You don't have to be a terribly lazy person to neglect something. Instead, you could be a forgetful person. And we often are forgetful people. You might have a to-do list of things that you need to do to maintain your home, but if you forget to do them, it's not going to do you any good. So in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Starts out by saying, therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things that we have heard, lest we drift away. We have to pay more attention to what we have heard, otherwise we'll drift away. That's being forgetful of what's happening. That's not paying attention to what's going on. And the actual illustration being made there is of a boat that is supposed to be tied to a dock or to a shore. And the idea is it's going to slowly drift away. Well, if you're in a boat and you forgot to tie it to the dock, is that really a big issue? No, because it's not going to jump 3 miles out to sea all of a sudden. It's going to take some time to get there. And the only way that happens, the only way that somebody drifts away from where they're supposed to be is if they're not paying attention, if they're forgetful of what they're supposed to be doing. And so it is with the home. In verse 3 of Hebrews chapter 2, it asks, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him? But how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? God has a process of salvation that saves the individual, but it also applies to the home at large. The home must be saved. If you're a Christian, you're attempting not only to save yourself, but also all the members of your household. If you're attempting to save them, but you neglect so great a salvation, then what's going to be the end result? Well, back in verse 2, we learned that you'll receive a just reward for your disobedience. So that's not going to be a good thing either. But maybe worse than laziness, maybe worse than forgetfulness is busyness. Being busy. A lot of us are very good at making ourselves very busy. It's not hard to do at all. If you remember the story in Luke chapter 10, starting down in verse 38, where Jesus comes to the household of Mary and Martha. And this is a story that you're probably familiar with. But when Jesus comes, one of the sisters comes and meets him and spends the whole time with Christ, listening to what he has to say. But then you have the other sister who does not. You have the other sister who, according to the text, was distracted with much serving. Now, was it wrong to serve? Well, no, not at all. Is it wrong to provide for somebody that's coming into your home? No, that's good hospitality. We talked about that last night. But what's being missed is that there's something of greater importance that is there as well. But if you're too busy to see what is so important, then you're going to have neglection that happens there. So we as people who love God, even if we love God, we spend a lot of time doing other things besides focusing on God. And it might be that you are binge watching through a show on Netflix. And there's nothing wrong with that, depending on the show, I suppose. But if you do that, and you don't focus on God, then there's a problem. And you can make sure that your children are attending every soccer practice that they have, and that they are at every game that they have. You can spend your time and you can make a beautiful house for yourself, a beautiful home, spend a lot of time on that. You can take great vacations, and you can go to exotic places and amazing things that you can do while you're on vacation. And you can teach your children to say please and thank you, and you can encourage your spouse to pursue their dreams. But if you do all of that and you neglect the salvation of your family, then what have you done? In Matthew chapter 16 and verse 26, a pair of the most powerful questions ever asked are asked by Christ. He has two things to say. Matthew 16:26, he says, "For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" I've always thought of that question in a very personal way, and of course it is a personal question, and it tests you, and it makes you ask, well, what am I doing? Is there anything that I'm trading my soul for? But that question can be extended to the whole family. And it might get even more personal if you do that. Because now you have to change the question a little bit. You have to ask instead, what does it profit my family if we gain the whole world but we lose our souls? Or what will I give in exchange for my family's soul? What will I give in exchange for my spouse's soul? What will I give in exchange for my child's soul? What's that valuable? What is that valuable on this whole earth that it's worth a child's soul, even your child's? Of course, there's nothing. But again, it comes back to busyness, it comes back to laziness, it comes back to a wrong priority as well. And that's the next thing that we're getting ready to talk about. Because when it comes to maintaining a home, we have to ask the question, how do we maintain a home? Because we know that it's important to maintain a home. We know that it needs to be maintained, but how do we do it? First and foremost, I will suggest that it must be a priority. You are not going to maintain your home if it is not a priority for you. And a lot of people don't take the time to make it a priority. And the problem is, the priority there is really God as a priority. So is God our first priority? In Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 and 38, you know that text there where Christ is responding to the question, what is the greatest command? Well, he says that the greatest command is to love the Lord your God. That's the absolute greatest command of any. So what is that telling us? God must be, and the love of God must be our number one priority in this life. And by extension, the church that he established, must be our number one priority in this life. So is it? In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33, again, I'm not telling you anything new here, but in this verse, Christ says that you seek first the kingdom of God and God's righteousness. When he says the kingdom of God, he's referring to the church. Christ says that there is nothing more important in the world, nothing that you need to put ahead of the church. So does he really think it's that important? I think so. According to Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25, we're told that Christ laid down his life for the church. Let me ask you two things. Number one, what are you giving up for the church? You ever considered laying down your life for the church? Number two, if the church is worth laying down your life for, or if Christ thought that the church was worth laying down his life for, then is it important to be there when the church assembles? I think so. And I'm not trying to preach to you on attendance, but let me ask you a question. And this might be getting a little bit personal, and this might be stepping on some toes, and I think I'm okay with that. On Monday night, we were here, we were assembled as a group of believers. We were coming together with Christ to learn more about Christ. Where were you? Were you here? Why weren't you here? Same thing Tuesday night. We were in Berea. Your preacher, Mike Johnson, was in Berea preaching a lesson about Christ. Where were you? See, the thing is, I grew up here. I recognize most of the people in this room, but I didn't see all of the faces there those nights. But that's not the most concerning question I have. The most concerning question I have is, why won't you be there tomorrow night? And why won't you be there Friday night? You can make excuses. We all make excuses. You can have explanations. But the fact is this: God is not the number one priority in our lives if we're not willing to meet with him. I also have some practical suggestions. Some practical suggestions on how to maintain a home. First practical suggestion is this: read the Bible as a family. It sounds really simple, but most people don't do it. You cannot grow spiritually, your family cannot grow spiritually unless the Bible is being read at home. You would never consider, you would never think that it was okay to let your family starve. Nobody would. You would work as hard as you could to prevent that from happening. You might be willing to steal if that's what it took to provide food for your family to eat rather than watch them starve. But when families don't read the Bible, they are starving spiritually. The only difference between those two things, between not feeding your family physically and not feeding them spiritually, is one of them can only kill you. If your family doesn't get enough food, they'll die. That's bad. If your family doesn't get enough spiritual food, they may be lost in hell for eternity. That's worse. They have to be fed spiritually. They have to read the Word. And it's not enough just to read, but you have to study the Word as well. If you remember the Ethiopian eunuch that's converted in Acts chapter 8, when that happens, when he's on the road, he asks the question of Philip. He says, "How can I understand unless someone is there to explain it to me?" And in the home, a lot of time that's going to be the case as well, that there has to be explanation given. So don't just read the Bible with your family, but make sure they understand the Bible and understand the meaning behind it, the principles that are there. There's also worship. You have to worship as a family. You cannot come to worship and expect that your family is going to worship unless you set an example. And I'm not just talking to parents here. It doesn't matter who it is. If you know that your parents aren't worshiping like they're supposed to, then as a child, you set the example. You show them how they're supposed to be worshiping, because sometimes that's what it takes. But I also know what happens. I know that as much as people would like to come together to worship, they end up, instead of being in the place of worship, they end up near the place of worship. They end up in the lobby near where worship is happening. Well, why does that happen? Well, it goes back to priority. But also, if you're in the lobby, if you're not in here, you're not doing any good for yourself. But what example are you setting for your family? What example are you setting for other families? Worship has to be done as a family, or it's worthless. So worship. Also have to talk to God. You have to talk to God. You have to pray to God. How do you expect for your family to grow any closer to God and to know God if you aren't willing to talk to Him together as a family? So prayer must be there, and it must be there without ceasing. It must be there regularly, not just at meal times like is so often the case. Another suggestion is that we have to talk as a family. Not just with God, but talk together as a family. Maybe that doesn't sound quite as spiritual, but that's something that's equally necessary. If you talk to each other, then you will have more time to interact spiritually. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, and verse 6 and following, the law there tells that you are supposed to teach your children all of the time. When you lie down, when you rise up, you're supposed to put it on your doorpost, you're supposed to put it on your gate, you're supposed to put it between your eyes. Wherever you can remind yourself of God's word, that's what you're supposed to do. And as far as the family is concerned, unless the whole family is devoted to doing that, it's not going to make any difference. And it doesn't make any difference. Also, as a family, you have to resolve conflict. And again, that might not sound quite as spiritual, but conflicts within a family, tensions within a family build over time. And when tensions build over time, then families become divided. And that's exactly what the enemy, our enemy, Satan, would like, is a divided home. Because it's a lot easier to take over a divided home. But again, those are some practical suggestions of things to do as a family. But with any kind of home maintenance, I don't think that it's overly difficult to understand. It's not difficult to maintain a home. All you have to do is clean out your gutters. It's not too hard. You have to redo your deck every year, probably, restain it, reseal your driveway, and make sure that you repaint when it's necessary. There's just small things that it takes to maintain a home. But over time, those things build up, and if they don't get done, then the home deteriorates. And those things don't get done when they're neglected out of laziness, out of forgetfulness, or out of being too busy to do those things. But imagine this. Imagine that you are trying your best to maintain your home, that you're doing absolutely everything that you can to maintain your home. But every time that you turn around, somebody is there, and they are trying to break something. Every time that you're there, they are trying to mess something else up. And maybe they are messing up a paint job that you recently did. Maybe they're breaking a lamp, or maybe they are setting a fire even. Now, if you've had that experience, you've probably had a toddler, but that's not what I'm referring to. Satan, our enemy, wants the home destroyed. He absolutely wants it to be completely destroyed. According to 1 Peter chapter 5 and in verse 8, the devil walks about like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And the imagery there is pretty perfect because the devil is cowardly, like a lion perhaps, but he's cowardly when it comes to the way that he attacks Christians. He doesn't want to attack them in a group. It's more difficult. That's why we meet together. He doesn't want to even have to attack a whole family at the same time, but if he can divide and conquer, if he can divide the family first, then it's easier to pick off a meal one at a time. So Satan is working very hard against God's plan for the home. And we talked about that on Monday, that Satan offers all of these other options for what a home could look like, but they really aren't options, they're lies. But also in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 11, we're told that we already know the plans that Satan has. So those plans are already revealed to us, which means this. We know what to do. We know what it takes to maintain a home. It's not that difficult. There's a lot of little things that have to happen, but if we are willing to do those things, then we are going to be able to maintain the home. But he wants the home to become dilapidated. He wants the home to become desolate. He wants to make sure that it falls in, that it falls apart, and that nobody is left there that's a Christian. But it's up to us to decide whether Satan is going to be allowed to do that or not. So tonight, that choice is going to be yours. Are you going to preserve your home? Are you going to preserve your family? Are you going to maintain it? Or are you going to keep putting it off? Because again, the option is there. That's actually the end of my class. So, my suggestion is, if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask those. Or if you have any thoughtful comments or personal insults, that's fine too. And Louis, that's probably from you if it's a personal insult.